raising their hands and saying, we want to engage in what's perceived as seditious activity. We want to, do things that our government doesn't necessarily want us to do. If you're in Venezuela or Lebanon, that's not that big of a deal, right? I mean, the governments are not capable of tracking you down in those situations. They certainly can come to your door with jackbooted thugs and beat down your door and subject you to torture that you may not experience in the developed world. But the realistic risks of being tracked down as a money launderer or as a unlicensed distributor and money transfer service are quite low in those regimes, which is why you see those regimes being the center of money laundering activity and drug distribution and everything else, right? In the developed world, what you've largely seen is governments ignoring the problems and issues associated with crypto to this point, and that feels like it's changing very rapidly. And just in all seriousness, that feels like the biggest underappreciated risk. And the second component that I tie to that is the narrative that exists around that, which is people in the space saying, well, that's completely unreasonable that the government would do that. If the government does that, then they're, truly, a Leviathan that is, evil and they should be resisted, right? Like, I'm sorry, that's just not true. Most of the regulations that were put in place across the financial system were put there to protect participants. They weren't there to try to, stamp you down and prohibit you from investing in lucrative investment opportunities. Things like accredited investors who have to have a certain level of income or wealth before they're able to invest in certain types of speculative activities, whether that's a private equity fund or venture capital or various other things. That's not being done because people who have money hate you, right? It's being done because there's just so much evidence of fraud and scams that that a line was drawn. You may disagree with that line. You can certainly lobby to have that changed, and I applaud people who are willing to do that. But it's not that that these restrictions were put in place to keep people down. They were there because the incidence of fraud with the lack of regulation tends to be so high that it was just expedient to say, let's cut it out. Let's not do it. Right? I mean, it's fantastic that you can use Bitcoin for transferring. I had a discussion with somebody today. Like, I use Bitcoin to transfer $10,000, in a real estate transaction. And it cost me less than 50 cents. And it took no time whatsoever. I transferred it from one of my accounts to another account. And it was, much, much, much easier than doing a bank wire transfer. And my reaction to them was like, okay, well, wait a second. One, why do you think that number was 10,000? Two, you transferred money from one of your accounts to another account. Like, that's not that impressive. If you tried doing that with $100 million under the framework that you just described, you just broke any number of laws, right? And the reason why a bank wire transfer has all the problems of know your customer and, did you really mean to transfer this $100 million? And we're not entirely sure you should be allowed to transfer this $100 million. What are the uses and purposes of it? All the things that make people say, well, what the hell is it your business, right? That's there because they don't want arms merchants and drug dealers and everybody else doing it, right? If you're Citibank, transferring $100 million is not hard for a very simple reason. You do it all the time. So we inhabit this world where, unfortunately, the language of lack of trust of institutions has created conditions under which people are uniquely exposed to an actual crackdown. And it feels like that's starting to happen.
Well, your answer uniquely segued us into one of my questions, which was, I saw you chatting about it earlier, the Canadian trucker convoy situation. And for anyone who isn't paying attention to it, the idea is that there's a lot of truckers in Canada who can't. They have to get vaccinated, basically, is what the government is telling them. They have to get vaccinated for coronavirus, and they don't want to. And so they put up essentially a protest. They've gone into Ottawa, and they've gone onto bridges and stopped traffic between Canada and the U.S. and they've made a lot of noise about this. And there's a lot of people. It seems like there's a lot of people who agree with them and think they shouldn't have to do this. Regardless, I'm not trying to touch on that part of this story. What I am trying to talk about, though, is that they tried to have a GoFundMe that got shut down, and then they tried a different funding mechanism that also got shut down. Now they resorted to utilizing funding through Bitcoin, and now, 20 wallets or so got blacklisted by the Canadian government. And so I just want to hear your thoughts on that in general, I guess, what it means, why it does drive home the points that you were mentioning before, but also what that means for Bitcoin in general.
So I think Bitcoin is actually an ancillary component of that story, right? And so I want to emphasize, and hopefully this has been clear on Twitter, I actually deeply support the Canadian truck drivers' right to protest.